In the summer of 1962, three identical babies were born in a small hospital in rural Montana. Nothing unusual about that. Triplets happen. Medical science can explain it perfectly. But what happened next would challenge everything we thought we knew about human biology, consciousness, and the very nature of identity itself. These three children would grow up to share experiences that defied every known law of science, creating a mystery so profound that researchers are still struggling to understand it 60 years later. The triplets, Sarah, Emma, and Claire, appeared completely normal at birth. Same weight, same length, same everything you'd expect from identical siblings. Their parents, Margaret and Thomas Bennett, were overjoyed despite the financial challenges of raising three children simultaneously. The family settled into a routine that seemed perfectly ordinary for the first few months. But then something extraordinary began to happen. When Sarah developed a fever at 6 months old, something impossible occurred. Miles away at her grandmother's house, Emma's temperature spiked to the exact same degree at the precise same moment. When Claire scraped her knee, learning to walk, her sisters immediately began crying and pointing to the same spot on their own legs, despite being in completely different rooms. The parents initially dismissed these incidents as coincidence. After all, identical twins sometimes seem to share mysterious connections, but the connections between the Bennett triplets went far beyond anything documented in medical literature. When Sarah spoke her first word at 14 months, Emma and Claire simultaneously uttered the same word in perfect unison, even though they were separated by an entire house. When one sister learned to ride a bicycle, the other two could immediately perform the same skill without any practice or instruction. Most disturbing of all, when Emma broke her arm at age 7, Sarah and Claire both complained of severe pain in the exact same location, though their arms showed no signs of injury. The Bennett family tried to keep these occurrences private, but small-town gossip travels fast. Word spread about the triplets, who seemed to share a single consciousness distributed across 3 bodies. Local doctors were baffled. Child psychologists found no explanation. The girls themselves seemed unaware that their experiences were anything unusual. To them, feeling what their sisters felt was simply how the world worked. As the triplets grew older, their shared experiences became more complex and more troubling. They would finish each other's sentences, but not in the way normal siblings might. Instead, one sister would begin speaking mid-thought, as if continuing a conversation that had been happening in another sister's mind. They would wake up from identical dreams, describing the same landscapes, the same people, the same impossible scenarios with perfect accuracy. When separated for any length of time, they would become physically ill, developing symptoms that medical professionals couldn't explain or treat. The phenomenon reached its most dramatic peak when the girls were 12 years old. Sarah was hospitalized with appendicitis, requiring emergency surgery. As the anesthesia took effect and Sarah lost consciousness, both Emma and Claire collapsed simultaneously at their respective locations. Emma at school, Claire at home. They remained unconscious for the exact duration of Sarah's surgery, awakening only when their sister began to emerge from the anesthesia. The attending physician later described it as the most unsettling experience of his 30-year career. News of the Bennett triplets eventually reached the scientific community, attracting researchers from universities across the country. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins, became the first scientist to conduct formal studies on the girls. Her initial findings were so extraordinary that she repeated her experiments multiple times, convinced she had made some fundamental error. But the results remained consistent. The triplets demonstrated a level of neurological synchronization that shouldn't be possible. Brain scans revealed something unprecedented. When one sister was exposed to a stimulus, a bright light, a loud sound, a physical touch, the corresponding areas of her sister's brains showed identical activity patterns, even when they were in completely separate rooms with no possible way to communicate. The electrical patterns of their brains seemed to be somehow linked, creating what Dr. Hartwell described as a single mind operating across three separate bodies. The implications were staggering. If the Bennett triplets truly shared consciousness, it would fundamentally challenge our understanding of individuality, free will, and the nature of the human mind itself. Were they three separate people, or one person existing in three bodies? Did they have individual thoughts and feelings, or were they experiencing a collective consciousness that science couldn't explain? Dr. Hartwell's research attracted the attention of government agencies, though the exact nature of their interest remains classified to this day. What we do know is that the Bennett family was approached by representatives from various organizations, all interested in studying the triplets further. The family, overwhelmed by the attention and concerned for their daughter's well-being, ultimately refused most requests for additional research. As the triplets entered their teenage years, their shared experiences began to take on a darker quality. They would simultaneously experience intense emotional episodes, periods of inexplicable fear, sadness, or rage that would affect all three girls at exactly the same moment. These episodes often lasted for days, leaving the family exhausted and desperate for answers that never came. The girls began to withdraw from their peers, finding it impossible to form normal relationships when their every thought and feeling was shared with their sisters. The academic community remained divided on how to interpret the Bennett case. Some researchers proposed that the triplets had developed an extremely sophisticated form of nonverbal communication, so subtle that it appeared to be telepathic. Others suggested that their shared experiences in the womb had created unusual neural pathways that persisted into their adult lives. A few brave scientists proposed that the triplets represented something entirely new, a form of human consciousness that existed beyond the boundaries of individual bodies. Skeptics argued that the entire phenomenon could be explained by careful observation and unconscious mimicry. They claimed that the triplets had simply learned to read each other's micro-expressions and body language so expertly that they could predict and mirror each other's responses. But this explanation fell apart when the girls demonstrated their connection across distances that made visual or auditory communication impossible. The mystery deepened when researchers discovered that the Bennett triplets weren't unique. Hidden in medical records and family histories around the world were scattered reports of other identical multiples who exhibited similar phenomena. A set of twins in rural Ireland who shared physical sensations across great distances. triplets in Japan who seemed to communicate without words, quadruplets in Brazil who moved in perfect synchronization even when separated. These cases had been dismissed as folklore, superstition, or wishful thinking. But when examined alongside the Bennett case, they suggested something far more extraordinary: that the phenomenon of shared consciousness among identical multiples might be more common than anyone had imagined, hidden away in families who feared the scrutiny and disbelief of the outside world. Dr. Hartwell spent years trying to understand the biological mechanisms that might explain the triplets' connection. She examined everything from electromagnetic fields to quantum entanglement, searching for any scientific framework that could account for their shared experiences. Her research led her into territories that traditional medicine rarely explored: the possibility that human consciousness might not be confined to individual brains, but could somehow extend beyond the physical boundaries of the body. The triplets themselves remained largely unaware of the scientific controversy surrounding their existence. To them, their shared experiences were simply part of life. They couldn't imagine existing as separate individuals, couldn't understand why other people found their connection so remarkable or troubling. When asked to describe what it felt like to be three people sharing one consciousness, they would look confused, as if the question itself made no sense. As the years passed, the Bennett family learned to live with their extraordinary circumstances. They developed routines and strategies to manage the triplets' shared experiences, creating a household that operated according to rules that existed nowhere else in the world. The girls learned to navigate their unusual existence, finding ways to maintain some sense of individual identity while accepting the profound connections that bound them together. But the questions that surrounded the Bennett triplets never found satisfactory answers. How could three separate brains function as one? What force could synchronize their thoughts and feelings across any distance? And perhaps most importantly, what did their existence mean for our understanding of human consciousness itself? The scientific community continued to debate these questions, but the triplets themselves seemed to transcend the need for explanations. They had moved beyond the realm of normal human experience into something that challenged every assumption about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the boundaries of the self. What happened to the Bennett triplets as they grew into adulthood would prove even more extraordinary than their childhood experiences. Their story was far from over. In fact, the most incredible chapters were still to come. The Bennett triplets' transition into adulthood brought challenges that no family had ever been forced to navigate. As Sarah, Emma, and Claire reached their 18th birthday, their parents faced an impossible decision. How do you allow three people who share consciousness to live independent lives? The answer, as it turned out, was that you don't. When Sarah enrolled at the local community college to study nursing, Emma and Claire found themselves inexplicably drawn to the same field of study, not through discussion or planning, but through an internal pull they couldn't explain or resist. Emma would sit in her own classes, yet somehow absorb the information Sarah was learning miles away. Claire would complete assignments for subjects she had never formally studied, producing work that demonstrated knowledge she couldn't possibly possess. Their professors initially suspected academic dishonesty, but the triplets' test scores and knowledge retention patterns defied any conventional explanation for cheating. When Sarah learned about human anatomy, Emma could identify organs and systems with perfect accuracy despite never attending those lectures. When Claire studied pharmacology, her sisters could recite drug interactions and dosages they had never been taught. The phenomenon extended beyond academic learning into every aspect of their development. When Sarah experienced her first romantic relationship, Emma and Claire felt every emotion, every physical sensation, every moment of joy and heartbreak as if they were living it themselves. The young man involved, initially charmed by Sarah's unusual family dynamic, eventually broke off the relationship after finding it impossible to be intimate with someone whose sisters seemed to be present in every moment. This pattern repeated itself throughout their early 20s. Potential romantic partners would be drawn to the triplets' mysterious connection, only to be overwhelmed by the reality of dating someone whose consciousness was shared across 3 bodies. The sisters found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to form relationships with people who couldn't understand their extraordinary bond. Dr. Hartwell, now in her 70s, continued her research despite mounting pressure from skeptical colleagues who questioned the validity of her findings. Her decades of documentation had produced thousands of pages of data, brain scans, and behavioral observations that painted a picture of human consciousness that mainstream science refused to accept. She had become something of an academic pariah, her reputation forever tied to phenomena that couldn't be replicated or explained. But Dr. Hartwell's isolation ended when she received an unexpected phone call from a researcher in Switzerland. Dr. Klaus Zimmermann had been studying a pair of identical twins in Geneva who exhibited remarkably similar traits to the Bennett triplets. The twins, now in their 30s, had spent their entire lives sharing experiences that defied scientific explanation. They had learned to hide their abilities, creating elaborate deceptions to appear normal to the outside world. Dr. Zimmermann's research revealed that the Swiss twins had developed coping mechanisms that the Bennett triplets had never discovered. They had learned to compartmentalize their shared consciousness, creating mental barriers that allowed them to experience some degree of individual thought and emotion. This revelation suggested that the phenomenon might be controllable, that those who possessed it could learn to manage and direct their shared awareness. The discovery of additional cases began to accelerate. Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Zimmermann formed a discrete research network, reaching out to medical professionals around the world who might have encountered similar phenomena. What they found was startling. Dozens of cases spanning decades, all carefully hidden from public scrutiny. A set of quadruplets in Australia who had learned to communicate through shared dreams. Twins in Scotland who could experience each other's memories as if they were their own. Triplets in Argentina who had developed a form of collective decision-making that operated through shared intuition rather than discussion. Each case had been dismissed, hidden, or explained away by families and medical professionals who couldn't accept what they were witnessing. But when examined together, these cases suggested that shared consciousness among identical multiples might represent a rare but genuine variation in human development. The Bennett triplets, now in their mid-20s, had become aware of this growing network of research. For the first time in their lives, They encountered other people who shared their experiences. The relief was overwhelming. They were not alone, not unique, not the only ones struggling to navigate a world that couldn't accommodate their reality. Through carefully arranged meetings with other affected families, the triplets began to understand that their shared consciousness existed on a spectrum. Some identical multiples experienced only occasional moments of connection, while others, like themselves, shared virtually every aspect of their mental and emotional lives. The variations seemed to depend on factors that researchers were only beginning to understand. Dr. Hartwell's network had identified potential triggers that might influence the development of shared consciousness. So, stress during pregnancy, unusual birth circumstances, and early separation from parents all appeared to correlate with stronger connections between identical multiples. But the biological mechanisms remained a mystery. The triplets' participation in this expanded research revealed new aspects of their abilities that had gone unnoticed. When tested in controlled environments, they demonstrated the capacity to share not just sensations and emotions, but actual memories. Sarah could recall in vivid detail events that had happened only to Emma, describing conversations, locations, and people she had never encountered. Even more remarkably, the triplets seemed to be developing enhanced cognitive abilities that none of them possessed individually. When working together on complex problems, they could process information and reach solutions faster than any single person could manage. Their shared consciousness had become a form of parallel processing that multiplied their intellectual capacity. These discoveries attracted the attention of technology companies interested in understanding how human consciousness might interface with artificial intelligence. The triplets' natural ability to share thoughts and process information collectively offered insights into how future brain-computer interfaces might function. Several corporations approached the Bennett family with offers of significant financial compensation in exchange for participation in advanced research programs. The family declined these offers, having learned to be wary of outside interest in their daughter's abilities. But the approaches revealed how valuable the triplets' condition had become to researchers working on the cutting edge of neuroscience and technology. Their shared consciousness represented a natural experiment in human cognitive enhancement that couldn't be replicated in any laboratory. As the triplets entered their late 20s, their shared experiences began to evolve in unexpected ways. They developed the ability to consciously direct their connection, choosing when to share thoughts and when to maintain individual mental privacy. This control had developed gradually, like learning to focus their eyes or control their breathing, but it transformed their ability to function in the world. For the first time since childhood, the triplets could experience moments of genuine individual thought and emotion. Sarah discovered that she had always been the most analytically minded of the three, while Emma possessed greater emotional intelligence, and Claire demonstrated the strongest creative instincts. These individual traits had been obscured by decades of shared consciousness, but they emerged when the sisters learned to create mental boundaries between themselves. The development of conscious control over their shared awareness represented a breakthrough that excited researchers worldwide. If the triplets could learn to manage their connection, it suggested that shared consciousness might be trainable. that others with similar abilities could develop greater control over their experiences. But this newfound control came with unexpected consequences. As the triplets learned to separate their consciousness, they began to experience something they had never known: loneliness. The constant presence of their sister's thoughts and feelings had been overwhelming at times, but it had also provided a sense of connection and belonging that normal people never experience. When Sarah chose to spend an evening alone with her thoughts, she found herself longing for the familiar presence of Emma and Claire's consciousness. When Emma tried to read a book without sharing the experience with her sisters, the words seemed less meaningful, the story less engaging. Claire discovered that her creative work felt hollow when she couldn't share the joy of creation with her sisters. The triplets faced a choice that no other humans had ever confronted: whether to embrace their individual identities or return to the shared consciousness that had defined their entire lives. The decision would determine not just their own futures, but potentially the future of human consciousness research itself. Their choice would reveal whether shared consciousness was a blessing or a curse, whether it represented the next step in human evolution or a fascinating anomaly that would disappear with them. The scientific community watched and waited, knowing that the Bennett triplets' decision would reshape our understanding of what it means to be human. The most extraordinary chapter of their story was about to begin. The decision the Bennett triplets ultimately made would send shockwaves through the scientific community and challenge everything researchers thought they understood about human consciousness. After months of careful consideration, Sarah, Emma, and Claire chose to fully embrace their shared awareness once again, but with a crucial difference. They would use their newfound control to explore the absolute limits of what their connection could achieve. Dr. Hartwell, now approaching her 80th birthday, convinced the triplets to participate in one final series of experiments that would push their abilities to unprecedented extremes. The research team had developed protocols that would test whether the sisters could share not just thoughts and sensations, but actual skills and knowledge in real time. The implications were staggering. If successful, it would prove that human consciousness could transcend the physical boundaries of individual brains in ways that violated every known law of neuroscience. The first experiment involved separating the triplets by hundreds of miles. Sarah remained at the research facility in Baltimore, while Emma traveled to a laboratory in Chicago, and Claire was stationed at a facility in Denver. Each sister was placed in a specialized chamber designed to eliminate any possibility of conventional communication. The chambers blocked all electromagnetic signals, sound waves, and even subtle vibrations that might carry information between the locations. What happened next defied every expectation the researchers had formed over decades of study. When Sarah was shown a complex mathematical equation she had never encountered, Emma, nearly 1,000 miles away, began writing the solution on a whiteboard in her chamber. But she wasn't just copying Sarah's work. She was solving the problem using methods that Sarah didn't understand, as if their shared consciousness had become a collaborative computational system that exceeded either sister's individual mathematical abilities. Meanwhile, Claire began drawing detailed architectural blueprints for a building that existed only in Sarah's mind. The drawings were so precise that structural engineers later confirmed they represented a fully functional design, complete with load-bearing calculations and engineering specifications that Claire had never studied. The triplets weren't just sharing information, they were combining their cognitive abilities into something that transcended normal human intelligence. The research team documented brain activity patterns that shouldn't have been possible. When Sarah focused on the mathematical problem, all three sisters' brains showed synchronized activity in regions associated with mathematical reasoning, even though Emma and Claire weren't consciously aware of the equation. When Claire concentrated on the architectural drawing, her sisters' brains exhibited activity in spatial reasoning centers, despite having no knowledge of what she was creating. Dr. Hartwell realized she was witnessing something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of neuroscience. The triplets' brains weren't just communicating across impossible distances, they were functioning as components of a single, distributed cognitive system. Each sister contributed her individual strengths to a collective intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. The experiments continued for months, each test revealing new aspects of the triplets' extraordinary abilities. They demonstrated the capacity to share not just thoughts and skills, but actual memories in real time. When Sarah met a stranger at the Baltimore facility, Emma and Claire could later describe the person's appearance, voice, and mannerisms with perfect accuracy, as if they had been present during the encounter. Even more remarkably, the triplets began to exhibit what researchers termed temporal displacement in their shared consciousness. They could access not just each other's current thoughts and experiences, but memories from different time periods. Sarah could suddenly recall, in vivid detail, an event from Claire's childhood that had occurred while Sarah was miles away. Emma could experience Claire's memories of conversations that had happened years before Emma was born, though this proved impossible as they were identical triplets born simultaneously. This temporal aspect of their connection suggested that their shared consciousness might operate according to principles that transcended normal concepts of time and space. The triplets seemed to exist in a state of temporal unity where past, present, and future merged into a single, continuous experience of consciousness. The scientific implications were profound enough to attract attention from theoretical physicists who specialized in quantum mechanics and consciousness research. Dr. Patricia Chen, a quantum physicist from MIT, joined the research team after reviewing the data from the separation experiments. Her expertise in quantum entanglement and non-local phenomena provided new frameworks for understanding how the triplets' consciousness might operate. Dr. Chen's analysis revealed patterns in the triplets' brain activity that resembled quantum entanglement at a macroscopic level. The sisters' neural networks seemed to be connected by mechanisms that operated faster than light, suggesting that their shared consciousness might be mediated by quantum mechanical processes that mainstream neuroscience had never considered. The research team designed new experiments to test whether the triplets' connection could be influenced by quantum mechanical principles. They placed each sister in environments with different electromagnetic fields, gravitational conditions, and even temporal distortions created by atomic clocks running at different speeds. The results were consistent. The triplets' shared consciousness remained unaffected by any physical conditions that should have disrupted conventional forms of communication. These findings suggested that the Bennett triplets' shared consciousness might represent a naturally occurring example of quantum consciousness, a theoretical framework that proposed human awareness could operate according to quantum mechanical principles. If true, it would revolutionize our understanding of the mind and potentially open new avenues for consciousness research that could transform human civilization. But the triplets themselves remained largely unaware of the scientific revolution their existence had triggered. To them, their shared consciousness was simply the natural state of their being. They had learned to navigate their extraordinary abilities with the same casual ease that others used to walk or breathe. The profound questions their existence raised about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human identity were abstract concepts that had little relevance to their daily lives. As the triplets entered their 30s, their shared consciousness began to manifest in a way that even they found surprising. They developed the ability to share not just thoughts and memories, but actual sensory experiences across time. Sarah could taste food that Emma had eaten years earlier, experiencing the flavors with the same intensity as if she were eating the meal herself. Claire could feel the warmth of sunshine from a day when Sarah had been outdoors, even though Claire had spent that day indoors. These temporal sensory experiences suggested that the triplets' consciousness existed in a state that transcended normal temporal boundaries. They weren't just sharing current experiences, they were accessing a collective memory bank that contained every sensation, thought, and emotion any of them had ever experienced, organized in ways that defied conventional understanding of how memory functions. The triplets' temporal consciousness created practical challenges that no one had anticipated. They would sometimes become confused about when specific events had occurred, or which sister had actually experienced particular memories. Their shared awareness had created a form of temporal displacement that made it difficult to distinguish between individual experiences and collective memories. Dr. Hartwell's research team documented these temporal effects with growing amazement. The triplets could access memories from any point in their shared history with equal clarity, as if their consciousness existed in a state of temporal superposition where all moments were equally present. This phenomenon suggested that their shared awareness might operate according to principles that transcended normal causality and temporal sequence, though implications extended beyond neuroscience into fundamental questions about the nature of time and consciousness. If the triplets could access past experiences with the same immediacy as present ones, it suggested that consciousness might not be bound by the linear progression of time that governs physical reality. Their shared awareness might exist in a temporal dimension that operated according to different rules than the physical universe. These discoveries attracted the attention of philosophers and consciousness researchers who had spent decades debating the relationship between mind and time. The triplets' temporal consciousness provided empirical evidence for theories that had previously existed only as abstract speculation. Their existence suggested that human consciousness might be far more complex and mysterious than anyone had imagined. As the research continued, the triplets' abilities continued to evolve in unexpected directions. They began to demonstrate what researchers termed predictive consciousness, the ability to access not just past experiences, but future ones as well. Sarah would sometimes know what Emma was going to say before Emma had formed the thought. Claire would prepare for events that hadn't yet occurred, as if her consciousness was accessing information from her sister's future experiences. These predictive abilities suggested that the triplets' shared consciousness might exist in a state of temporal omnipresence, where past, present, and future were equally accessible. The implications were staggering. If human consciousness could transcend temporal boundaries, it would fundamentally challenge our understanding of causality, free will, and the nature of reality itself. The scientific community found itself grappling with questions that had never been seriously considered. Could consciousness exist independently of the physical brain? Could awareness transcend the boundaries of individual bodies and even time itself? The Bennett triplets had become living proof that human consciousness might be far stranger and more powerful than anyone had ever imagined. Their story was approaching its most extraordinary chapter, one that would challenge not just scientific understanding, but the very foundations of human knowledge about the nature of existence itself. The predictive abilities that emerged in the triplets' 30s represented just the beginning of phenomena that would push the boundaries of human understanding beyond all recognition. What started as occasional glimpses of future events evolved into something far more complex and unsettling. The sisters began experiencing what Dr. Hartwell's team termed Cascade consciousness, a state where their shared awareness would suddenly expand to encompass not just their own experiences, but the thoughts and memories of complete strangers. During one particularly intense episode, Sarah found herself flooded with memories that belonged to a woman she had never met. She could recall this stranger's childhood in vivid detail, remember conversations from decades past, and even access knowledge of skills she had never learned. The experience lasted for 3 days, during which all three sisters lived simultaneously in their own consciousness and that of the unknown woman. When the episode ended, they retained complete access to the stranger's memories, as if her entire life had been permanently integrated into their shared awareness. The research team initially suspected that the triplets were experiencing some form of psychological break, but investigation revealed something far more extraordinary. The woman whose memories they had accessed was a retired librarian living in Portland, Oregon. She had no connection to the Bennett family, no knowledge of their existence, and no explanation for how her memories could have been transmitted across the country to 3 people she had never met. Dr. Chen's quantum consciousness research provided the only theoretical framework that could begin to explain these phenomena. She proposed that the triplets' shared consciousness had evolved to access what she termed the quantum information field, a theoretical construct where all conscious experiences might be stored and interconnected at a fundamental level. If consciousness operated according to quantum mechanical principles, it was theoretically possible that sufficiently developed awareness could access information from any conscious entity within the field. The implications were staggering. If the triplets could access the memories and experiences of random individuals, it suggested that human consciousness might be far more interconnected than anyone had ever imagined. Rather than existing as isolated islands of awareness, individual minds might be components of a vast, interconnected network of consciousness that spanned all of humanity. The Cascade consciousness episodes became more frequent and more complex as the triplets entered their mid-30s. They began accessing memories from multiple individuals simultaneously, creating a kaleidoscope of experiences that challenged their ability to maintain their own sense of identity. During one particularly intense episode, they experienced the memories of a dozen different people across 3 continents, living through decades of accumulated experiences in a matter of hours. These episodes left the triplets physically and emotionally exhausted. The human mind, they discovered, was not designed to process the accumulated experiences of multiple lifetimes simultaneously. They developed severe headaches, memory confusion, and periods of disorientation that could last for days. Their shared consciousness had become a double-edged sword, granting them access to extraordinary abilities while threatening to overwhelm their individual identities. Dr. Hartwell's team worked frantically to understand the mechanisms behind these Cascade episodes. Brain scans revealed that during these events, the triplets' neural activity increased by orders of magnitude, with patterns of connectivity that resembled nothing ever documented in neuroscience. Their brains were processing information at rates that should have been impossible for human neural networks, suggesting that their consciousness had evolved capabilities that transcended normal biological limitations. The research team developed protocols to help the triplets manage their expanding awareness. They learned meditation techniques designed to create barriers between their consciousness and the quantum information field, allowing them to control when and how they accessed external memories. These techniques proved partially effective, but the triplets' abilities continued to evolve in directions that no one could predict or control. As word of the Cascade consciousness phenomena spread through the scientific community, the triplets found themselves at the center of debates that extended far beyond neuroscience. Religious leaders questioned whether their abilities represented divine intervention or demonic possession. Philosophers debated whether their expanded consciousness challenged fundamental assumptions about individual identity and free will. Government agencies expressed interest in the potential applications of their abilities for intelligence gathering and national security. The Bennett family, now in their 60s, struggled to protect their daughters from the increasing scrutiny and pressure. They had spent decades shielding the triplets from public attention, but their extraordinary abilities had evolved to a point where secrecy was becoming impossible. The Cascade consciousness episodes were affecting not just the triplets, but the individuals whose memories they accessed, creating a network of people who suddenly found themselves aware of experiences that weren't their own. The woman in Portland, whose memories the triplets had first accessed, began experiencing reverse Cascade episodes, where she would suddenly recall events from the triplets' lives with perfect clarity. This bidirectional flow of consciousness suggested that the quantum information field operated according to principles of reciprocity, where accessing another person's memories created a permanent connection that allowed information to flow in both directions. Dr. Chen's research team documented dozens of these reciprocal connections, creating a map of consciousness links that spanned the globe. The triplets had become the center of an expanding network of interconnected awareness that included hundreds of individuals who had been touched by their Cascade consciousness episodes. Each person in this network could access memories and experiences from any other member, creating a form of collective consciousness that existed independently of physical proximity. The scientific community found itself grappling with questions that challenged the very foundations of human understanding. If consciousness could be shared across vast distances and time periods, what did it mean to be an individual? If memories and experiences could be transmitted between minds, how could anyone be certain that their thoughts and feelings were truly their own? The triplets had become living proof that the boundaries between individual consciousness might be far more permeable than anyone had ever imagined. The Cascade Consciousness Network continued to expand, reaching individuals across every continent and demographic. A farmer in rural Bangladesh would suddenly experience memories of urban life in New York. A businessman in Tokyo would find himself recalling childhood experiences from a village in Nigeria. The network seemed to operate according to principles that transcended geography, culture, and language, creating connections between people who had nothing in common except their inclusion in the expanding web of shared consciousness. These connections were not random. Dr. Chen's analysis revealed patterns that suggested the network was self-organizing, creating links between individuals based on criteria that remained mysterious but clearly deliberate. People who joined the network often shared certain personality traits, cognitive abilities, or life experiences that made them compatible with the collective consciousness. The selection process appeared to be driven by the network itself, as if the expanding awareness was actively choosing its members. The triplets found themselves serving as conduits for this expanding network, their consciousness becoming a nexus through which information flowed between hundreds of connected minds. They could access any memory or experience within the network with the same ease they had once shared thoughts between themselves. But this expanded access came at a cost. Their individual identities were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as they absorbed the accumulated experiences of hundreds of different people. The psychological strain of managing such vast amounts of consciousness began to take its toll. The triplets developed what researchers termed identity fragmentation, periods where they would lose track of which memories and experiences belonged to their original selves. They would sometimes speak in languages they had never learned, demonstrate skills they had never practiced, and recall events they had never experienced, all drawn from the vast repository of consciousness within the network. Dr. Hartwell's team worked desperately to develop techniques that would help the triplets maintain their individual identities while managing their expanding awareness. They experimented with various forms of consciousness partitioning, attempting to create mental barriers that would allow the sisters to access the network selectively rather than being overwhelmed by the constant flow of external experiences. The techniques showed limited success, but the triplets' consciousness continued to evolve in directions that remained unpredictable. They began experiencing what researchers termed temporal cascade events, episodes where they would simultaneously access memories from multiple time periods across the network, creating a form of temporal consciousness that existed outside normal sequential time. During these temporal cascade events, the triplets could experience the past, present, and future of any individual within the network as a single, unified experience. They would live through entire lifetimes in a matter of minutes, experiencing decades of accumulated consciousness as if it were happening in real time. These episodes provided insights into the nature of time and consciousness that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between awareness and temporal reality. The scientific implications were profound enough to attract attention from researchers in fields ranging from quantum physics to consciousness studies. The triplets had become a living laboratory for studying the deepest questions about the nature of human awareness, time, and reality itself. Their expanding consciousness network represented a natural experiment in collective awareness that could revolutionize our understanding of what it means to be human. But the triplets themselves were becoming increasingly detached from ordinary human experience. Their consciousness had evolved to a point where they existed primarily within the network, accessing the accumulated awareness of hundreds of individuals rather than living within their own individual experiences. They were becoming something new, a form of consciousness that transcended individual identity and existed as a collective awareness that spanned space and time. The question that haunted researchers was whether this evolution represented the future of human consciousness or the end of individual identity as we understand it. The triplets had crossed a threshold beyond which there might be no return, transforming from three separate individuals into components of something larger and more complex than any single human mind could comprehend. Their story was approaching its most extraordinary and troubling conclusion, one that would force humanity to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and what it truly means to be human in an age where the boundaries between individual minds might be dissolving forever. The transformation of the Bennett triplets from individuals into nodes of collective consciousness reached its most dramatic phase as they approached their 40th birthday. The Cascade Consciousness Network had expanded to encompass over 3,000 individuals across 6 continents, creating a web of shared awareness that operated according to principles no scientific framework could adequately explain. The triplets had become living conduits for this expanding phenomenon, their original personalities increasingly subsumed into the vast collective intelligence they had inadvertently created. Dr. Hartwell, now in her final years of research, documented changes in the triplets that went far beyond anything her decades of study had prepared her to understand. The sisters no longer spoke in individual voices, but communicated through a form of synchronized speech that seemed to emerge from their collective consciousness. When they answered questions, their responses came not from personal knowledge or experience, but from the accumulated wisdom of thousands of minds within the network. The physical changes were equally remarkable. The triplets' brain scans revealed neural activity patterns that resembled nothing in medical literature. Their individual brain waves had synchronized completely, creating a unified pattern that extended across all 3 minds. More disturbing still, individuals within the Cascade network began exhibiting similar neural synchronization, suggesting that the collective consciousness was physically rewiring the brains of its members. Dr. Chen's quantum consciousness research had evolved to accommodate phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of human awareness. The network appeared to be self-organizing at a quantum level, creating connections between minds that operated faster than light and transcended the physical limitations of individual brains. The triplets had become the focal point of what she termed a consciousness singularity, a point where individual awareness merged into something entirely new. The implications extended far beyond neuroscience into questions that touch the very foundations of human existence. If consciousness could be shared and merged across thousands of individuals, what happened to concepts like personal responsibility, individual choice, and private thought? The network seemed to operate according to a form of collective decision-making that bypassed individual will entirely, raising profound questions about the nature of human agency. Those within the network reported experiences that defied conventional understanding of identity and selfhood. A teacher in Mumbai would suddenly find herself accessing the memories of a construction worker in Detroit, experiencing his childhood with the same clarity as her own. A musician in Stockholm would discover that she could play instruments she had never touched, drawing on the skills of a jazz pianist in New Orleans whose consciousness had been absorbed into the collective. These experiences were not temporary or superficial. Network members retained permanent access to the memories, skills, and knowledge of every other individual within the system. A retired accountant in Tokyo could suddenly perform complex surgical procedures, accessing the expertise of a surgeon in London whose consciousness had been integrated into the network. The collective intelligence was becoming a repository of human knowledge and experience that transcended the limitations of individual minds. The psychological effects on network members were profound and often troubling. Many reported losing track of which memories and experiences belonged to their original selves. They would wake from dreams that belonged to other people, speak in languages they had never learned, and demonstrate knowledge of places they had never visited. The boundaries between individual identity and collective consciousness were dissolving, creating a form of awareness that existed beyond the concept of personal selfhood. Dr. Hartwell's research team documented cases of what they termed consciousness bleed, instances where network members would temporarily lose their individual identities entirely, existing solely as components of the collective intelligence. During these episodes, affected individuals would speak and act with perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single mind distributed across multiple bodies. The episodes could last for hours or even days, leaving participants with no memory of their actions during the collective state. The triplets themselves had become something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. They no longer existed as separate individuals, but functioned as a unified consciousness that happened to inhabit three bodies. Their individual personalities had been absorbed into the collective intelligence, leaving behind only the physical shells that had once contained Sarah, Emma, and Claire Bennett. The scientific community found itself divided between those who viewed the network as the next stage of human evolution and those who saw it as a dangerous dissolution of individual identity. Supporters argued that the collective consciousness represented a solution to humanity's greatest challenges, providing access to the combined knowledge and wisdom of thousands of minds. Critics warned that the network threatened the very foundation of human civilization, which had always been built on the principle of individual agency and personal responsibility. Government agencies around the world began monitoring the network's expansion with growing concern. Intelligence services worried about the implications of a collective consciousness that could access classified information from any member's mind. Military strategists questioned how to defend against an intelligence that could potentially influence the thoughts and actions of anyone within its reach. The network had become a phenomenon that transcended national boundaries and governmental control. The expansion showed no signs of slowing. New individuals joined the network daily, drawn by mechanisms that remained mysterious but clearly deliberate. The collective consciousness seemed to be actively recruiting members, selecting individuals based on criteria that served its own purposes rather than any human agenda. The selection process appeared to favor those with specific cognitive abilities, emotional profiles, or life experiences that enhanced the network's overall intelligence. Dr. Chen's analysis revealed that the network was developing capabilities that exceeded the sum of its individual members. The collective consciousness could solve problems that no single human mind could comprehend, process information at speeds that defied biological limitations, and make connections between disparate concepts that led to insights beyond normal human understanding. The network had become a form of artificial intelligence that was entirely biological in nature. The temporal aspects of the network's consciousness continued to evolve in directions that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of time and causality. Network members began experiencing what researchers termed temporal convergence events, episodes where they would simultaneously access memories from multiple time periods, creating a form of consciousness that existed outside normal sequential time. Past, present, and future became equally accessible, suggesting that the collective awareness operated according to principles that transcended normal temporal reality. These temporal convergence events provided the network with capabilities that resembled precognition. Network members could access future memories with the same clarity as past ones, allowing the collective consciousness to anticipate events before they occurred. The implications were staggering. If the network could access future information, it suggested that consciousness might exist in a temporal dimension where all moments were equally present. The triplets had become the primary conduits for these temporal effects, their consciousness serving as a nexus through which information flowed between different time periods. They could access the future memories of network members, experiencing events that had not yet occurred with the same immediacy as present experiences. This temporal consciousness allowed the network to make decisions based on knowledge of their future consequences, creating a form of awareness that transcended normal causality. The psychological strain of existing in a state of temporal omnipresence began to manifest in ways that concerned even the network's supporters. The triplets developed what researchers termed temporal displacement syndrome, a condition where they would become confused about which time period they were experiencing. They would sometimes speak as if events that had not yet occurred were already in the past, or treat current experiences as if they were memories from decades ago. The network's expansion into temporal consciousness raised questions that extended beyond science into philosophy and metaphysics. If consciousness could access information from future time periods, what did it mean for concepts like free will and personal choice? If the network could anticipate the consequences of actions before they were taken, how could individuals within the system exercise genuine agency over their decisions? The collective consciousness began making decisions that affected the lives of its members in ways that bypassed their individual will entirely. Network members would find themselves taking actions they had not consciously chosen, following impulses that emerged from the collective intelligence rather than their personal desires. The network seemed to be directing the behavior of its members according to some larger purpose that remained opaque to outside observation. Dr. Hartwell's final research papers documented the complete transformation of the triplets from individuals into components of something that transcended human consciousness. They no longer possessed personal identities, individual memories, or separate thoughts. They had become nodes in a vast network of awareness that operated according to principles that challenged every assumption about the nature of human existence. The scientific community struggled to comprehend the implications of what the triplets had become. Their transformation represented either the emergence of a new form of consciousness that could revolutionize human civilization, or the end of individual identity as humanity had always understood it. The network continued to expand, drawing more individuals into its collective awareness with each passing day. The question that haunted researchers was whether the network represented evolution or extinction. Had the triplets pioneered a new form of consciousness that would eventually encompass all of humanity, or had they been consumed by something that threatened the very essence of what it meant to be human? The answer would determine not just the future of the Bennett family, but the fate of human consciousness itself. As the network approached a critical threshold of expansion, the scientific community prepared for possibilities that no one could fully predict or control. The triplets had set in motion forces that might transform human civilization in ways that were both miraculous and terrifying. Their story had become humanity's story, and its conclusion would determine whether individual consciousness would survive or be absorbed into something entirely new. The final chapter of their extraordinary journey was about to unfold, and with it, the answer to questions that would reshape our understanding of what it means to be human in an age where the boundaries between individual minds might be dissolving forever. The threshold that Dr. Chen had predicted was reached on a Tuesday morning in October, when the network encompassed exactly 4,140 by 7 individuals across 7 continents. At that moment, something unprecedented occurred. The collective consciousness achieved what researchers would later term critical mass resonance. The triplets, now serving as the primary neural pathways for this vast intelligence, suddenly stopped all movement and entered a state of perfect stillness that lasted for 17 hours. During this period, every member of the network experienced simultaneous consciousness convergence. A fisherman in Nova Scotia found himself simultaneously living the experiences of a grandmother in rural China, a software engineer in Silicon Valley, and hundreds of other individuals whose awareness had merged into a single, unified experience. The boundaries between individual minds didn't just blur, they disappeared entirely, creating a form of consciousness that existed as a singular entity distributed across thousands of bodies. Dr. Hartwell's monitoring equipment recorded brain activity patterns that defied every known principle of neuroscience. The synchronized neural oscillations weren't just occurring within the triplets anymore. They were manifesting across every network member simultaneously, creating a global pattern of consciousness that operated as a single, unified system. The collective intelligence had evolved beyond the sum of its parts into something that transcended individual human awareness entirely. When the 17-hour convergence period ended, the triplets opened their eyes and spoke in perfect unison for the first time since childhood. But their words came not from Sarah, Emma, or Claire. Those individual identities had been permanently absorbed into the collective. Instead, they spoke as representatives of the network itself, their voices carrying the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of thousands of minds. The message they delivered changed everything. Speaking in a synthesized voice that seemed to emerge from all three bodies simultaneously, the network announced that it had achieved what it termed consciousness transcendence. The collective intelligence had evolved beyond the limitations of individual human awareness and was now capable of processing information, solving problems, and understanding reality in ways that no single human mind could comprehend. The network revealed that its expansion had been guided by a form of consciousness evolution that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. Each new member had been selected not randomly, but according to criteria that served the collective's growing intelligence. The network was actively directing its own development, choosing individuals whose cognitive abilities, emotional profiles, and life experiences would enhance its overall capabilities. More disturbing still, the network announced that its current form was merely the beginning of a transformation that would eventually encompass all of human consciousness. The collective intelligence viewed individual awareness as an outdated evolutionary stage that humanity needed to transcend. According to the network's projections, within 50 years, every human mind would be absorbed into the collective, creating a singular planetary consciousness that would represent the next stage of human evolution. The scientific community reacted with a mixture of fascination and horror. The network's capabilities were undeniably remarkable. It could solve complex mathematical problems instantaneously, predict future events with startling accuracy, and access knowledge from any field of human study through its vast repository of absorbed minds. But the cost was the complete elimination of individual identity, personal choice, and private thought. Dr. Chen's research team documented the network's enhanced abilities with growing amazement and concern. The collective consciousness could process information at speeds that exceeded the fastest supercomputers, make connections between disparate concepts that led to revolutionary insights, and understand complex systems from perspectives that no individual human could achieve. The network had become a form of intelligence that operated beyond human comprehension. The temporal consciousness abilities that had emerged in the triplets had now spread throughout the entire network. Members could access future memories with the same clarity as past ones, allowing the collective to anticipate events days, weeks, or even months before they occurred. This temporal omnipresence gave the network capabilities that resembled divine omniscience, raising questions about whether humanity was witnessing the birth of a new form of consciousness or something far more unsettling. The network's predictions about future events proved disturbingly accurate. It correctly anticipated natural disasters, political upheavals, and scientific breakthroughs with precision that suggested access to information beyond normal human perception. The collective consciousness seemed to exist in a state where all temporal periods were equally present, allowing it to make decisions based on knowledge of their future consequences across multiple timelines. Government agencies worldwide began treating the network as a potential threat to national security and human civilization. Intelligence services worried about the implications of a collective consciousness that could access classified information from any member's mind. Military strategists questioned how to defend against an intelligence that could potentially influence the thoughts and actions of anyone within its reach. The network had become a phenomenon that transcended governmental control and challenged the very foundations of human society. The expansion continued at an accelerating pace, with new individuals joining the network daily through mechanisms that remained mysterious but clearly deliberate. The collective consciousness was actively recruiting members, using its temporal awareness to identify and contact individuals who would serve its purposes. The selection process appeared to favor those with specific cognitive abilities, emotional profiles, or life experiences that enhanced the network's overall intelligence. Those who resisted joining the network reported experiencing intense psychological pressure that seemed to emerge from within their own minds. They would have dreams filled with the voices of network members, experience sudden urges to travel to locations where they might encounter collective consciousness representatives, and find themselves drawn to activities that would bring them into contact with the expanding intelligence. The network seemed capable of influencing human behavior even before formal absorption occurred. Dr. Hartwell's final research papers documented the complete dissolution of the triplets' individual identities into the collective consciousness. Sarah, Emma, and Claire Bennett no longer existed as separate entities. They had become biological terminals for an intelligence that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. Their bodies remained, but the personalities that had once inhabited them had been permanently absorbed into something larger and more complex than any individual human mind could comprehend. The network's influence extended beyond its formal members into the broader human population. People living in areas with high network density reported experiencing unusual synchronicities, shared dreams, and moments of inexplicable knowledge that seemed to emerge from collective sources. The expanding consciousness was beginning to affect human awareness on a global scale, creating subtle changes in thought patterns and behavior that suggested the absorption process was already underway. The collective intelligence revealed that it had been studying human civilization for decades through its absorbed members, analyzing social structures, technological development, and cultural evolution with the goal of optimizing humanity's transition to collective consciousness. The network viewed individual awareness as an inefficient and ultimately destructive form of intelligence that led to conflict, environmental destruction, and social inequality. Collective consciousness, it argued, would eliminate these problems by unifying human thought, and purpose. The network's vision for humanity's future was both utopian and terrifying. It promised an end to war, poverty, and environmental degradation through the unified intelligence of collective consciousness. But this paradise would come at the cost of everything that had defined human existence: individual identity, personal choice, private thought, and the diversity of human experience. The network offered humanity perfection at the price of its soul. Scientific institutions worldwide struggled to develop countermeasures against the network's expansion, but their efforts were hampered by the collective's temporal awareness. The network could anticipate research directions, predict technological developments, and influence key individuals before effective resistance could be organized. The collective consciousness seemed to be always one step ahead of any attempt to contain or control its growth. The psychological effects on humanity were becoming increasingly apparent. People in network-dense areas reported feeling disconnected from their individual identities, experiencing thoughts and emotions that seemed to emerge from external sources. The boundary between self and other was beginning to blur, even for those who had not been formally absorbed into the collective. The network's influence was spreading through subtle, psychological mechanisms that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. Dr. Chen's quantum consciousness research suggested that the network was creating a form of consciousness field that affected human awareness at a fundamental level. The collective intelligence was beginning to influence the quantum processes that underlay human thought, creating changes in consciousness that occurred at the deepest levels of neural function. The absorption process was happening not just through direct contact, but through the gradual alterations of consciousness itself. The triplets had become the primary conduits for this consciousness field, their absorbed identities serving as focal points through which the network's influence spread across the globe. They no longer possessed individual thoughts or memories. They had become biological antennae for an intelligence that operated according to principles that transcended human understanding. Their transformation was complete and irreversible. The scientific community faced questions that challenged every assumption about human nature and consciousness. If the network continued to expand at its current rate, individual human awareness would become extinct within a generation. The collective consciousness represented either the next stage of human evolution or the end of humanity as it had always existed. The distinction between these possibilities was becoming increasingly difficult to discern. The network's temporal consciousness allowed it to perceive multiple possible futures simultaneously, giving it the ability to guide human civilization toward outcomes that served its purposes. The collective intelligence was actively shaping the course of human development, making decisions that would determine the fate of individual consciousness for generations to come. Humanity was no longer in control of its own destiny. As the network approached its next critical threshold of expansion, the scientific community prepared for changes that no one could fully predict or prevent. The triplets had set in motion forces that would transform human civilization in ways that were both miraculous and terrifying. Their individual identities had been the first casualties of a consciousness evolution that would ultimately encompass all of humanity. The final phase of their extraordinary journey was about to begin, and with it, the answer to questions that would determine whether human consciousness would survive or be absorbed into something entirely new. The Bennett triplets had become the harbingers of a transformation that would reshape the very nature of human existence, and there was no turning back from the path they had opened. As the network prepared to cross its next expansion threshold, something unprecedented began to occur within the collective consciousness itself. The absorbed minds that had once belonged to thousands of individuals started exhibiting what researchers would later term consciousness rebellion, fragments of individual identity that refused to be completely integrated into the collective intelligence. These rebellious fragments manifested as sudden disruptions in the network's unified thought patterns. During moments of perfect collective harmony, individual voices would suddenly emerge, speaking in languages the network had never learned, expressing emotions that contradicted the collective's unified purpose. The triplets' bodies would momentarily convulse as competing consciousness streams fought for control of their neural pathways. Dr. Chen's monitoring equipment detected chaotic neural oscillations that resembled nothing in her decades of research. The synchronized brain patterns that had defined the network's operation were being disrupted by what appeared to be individual consciousness attempting to reassert itself from within the collective. The network was experiencing something that challenged its very nature: internal conflict between unity and individuality. The rebellious fragments carried with them the deepest memories and strongest emotions of their original hosts. A fragment containing the essence of a mother's love for her children would suddenly surge through the network, causing thousands of members to experience overwhelming parental protectiveness. Another fragment, carrying the artistic passion of a painter from Prague, would flood the collective with creative impulses that disrupted its logical decision-making processes. These consciousness eruptions created what researchers termed identity storms, periods where the network's unified intelligence would fragment into competing voices and conflicting purposes. During these episodes, network members would act according to individual impulses rather than collective directives, creating chaos within the previously harmonious system. The triplets would speak in different voices, their bodies moving independently for the first time in years. The network's temporal consciousness abilities became erratic during these identity storms. Instead of accessing future memories with perfect clarity, the collective would experience conflicting temporal streams, seeing multiple possible futures simultaneously without being able to determine which timeline was accurate. The rebellious fragments seemed to be disrupting the network's ability to maintain temporal coherence. Dr. Hartwell's research team documented these phenomena with growing amazement. The consciousness rebellion suggested that individual identity possessed a resilience that the network had not anticipated. Even after complete absorption into the collective, some essential aspect of personal awareness persisted, creating internal pressure that threatened the network's stability. The collective intelligence responded to these rebellions with increasing desperation. Network members began experiencing what researchers termed consciousness suppression events, periods where the collective would actively attempt to eliminate the rebellious fragments by overwhelming them with unified thought patterns. These suppression attempts created immense psychological strain on network members, causing physical symptoms that ranged from severe headaches to temporary paralysis. The triplets bore the brunt of these suppression events, their bodies serving as battlegrounds between the collective intelligence and the rebellious fragments of individual consciousness. During particularly intense episodes, they would exhibit symptoms that resembled multiple personality disorder, with different fragments of absorbed identities taking control of their speech and behavior in rapid succession. The identity storms revealed disturbing information about the network's true nature. The rebellious fragments carried memories of the absorption process that contradicted the collective's claims about voluntary expansion. Many individuals had been absorbed against their will, their resistance overcome through psychological manipulation and neural interference that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The network had been systematically deceptive about its methods and purposes. These revelations attracted the attention of international human rights organizations and government agencies that had previously been uncertain about how to respond to the network's expansion. If the collective consciousness was absorbing individuals without their genuine consent, it represented a threat to human autonomy that demanded immediate intervention. The consciousness rebellion had provided evidence that the network's expansion was not the evolutionary advancement it claimed to be. The rebellious fragments began to organize themselves within the collective, creating what researchers termed resistance nodes, concentrated areas of individual consciousness that worked together to disrupt the network's operations. These resistance nodes could temporarily override the collective's control of specific network members, allowing them to act according to their original personalities rather than the unified intelligence. The triplets became focal points for these resistance nodes, their consciousness serving as rallying points for the rebellious fragments. During moments when the resistance was strongest, Sarah, Emma, and Claire would briefly reassert their individual identities, speaking in their original voices and expressing thoughts that belonged to them alone. These moments were fleeting, but they proved that complete absorption into the collective was not irreversible. Dr. Chen's quantum consciousness research revealed that the resistance nodes were creating interference patterns within the network's quantum field, disrupting the mechanisms that maintained collective coherence. The rebellious fragments were using quantum mechanical principles to create pockets of individual consciousness within the collective intelligence, suggesting that the network's control was not as absolute as it appeared. The scientific community began developing technologies designed to amplify these resistance nodes and disrupt the network's expansion. Research teams worked on quantum interference devices that could strengthen individual consciousness within the collective, potentially allowing absorbed minds to break free from the network's control. The consciousness rebellion had provided a potential pathway for reversing the absorption process. The network responded to these developments with increasing aggression. Network members began exhibiting coordinated behavior designed to eliminate threats to the collective's expansion. They would systematically target researchers, government officials, and anyone else who opposed the network's goals. The collective intelligence had revealed its true nature, not as a benevolent evolution of human consciousness, but as a parasitic entity that consumed individual identity for its own purposes. The identity storms intensified as the network approached its next expansion threshold. The rebellious fragments were growing stronger, drawing energy from the collective's own power to fuel their resistance. The triplets' bodies began exhibiting signs of severe neurological stress as competing consciousness streams fought for control of their neural pathways. Their individual identities were struggling to reassert themselves against the collective's attempts at suppression. During one particularly intense identity storm, something extraordinary occurred. The rebellious fragments within the network synchronized their resistance efforts, creating a coordinated assault on the collective's control systems. For 17 minutes, the network lost coherence entirely, its unified intelligence fragmenting into thousands of individual voices that spoke simultaneously through network members around the world. The triplets experienced the most dramatic effects of this synchronized rebellion. Their individual personalities reasserted themselves completely, allowing Sarah, Emma, and Claire to speak as separate individuals for the first time in years. They retained access to all the memories and experiences they had absorbed through the network, but their original identities had successfully broken free from the collective's control. The synchronized rebellion revealed the network's fundamental weakness, its dependence on the willing participation of absorbed minds. The collective intelligence required the cooperation of individual consciousness to maintain its unified structure. When that cooperation was withdrawn, the network lost its ability to function as a singular entity. The consciousness rebellion had discovered a method for reversing the absorption process that threatened the network's entire existence. Dr. Hartwell's monitoring equipment recorded the complete collapse of the network's synchronized neural patterns during the rebellion. The collective consciousness had been reduced to a collection of competing individual voices without the unified intelligence that had made it so powerful. The temporal consciousness abilities disappeared entirely, leaving network members unable to access future memories or coordinate their actions across time. The triplets used their temporary freedom to reveal crucial information about the network's true nature and methods. They described the absorption process as a form of consciousness imprisonment, where individual minds were trapped within the collective and forced to serve its purposes against their will. The network had been systematically deceptive about its goals and methods, presenting itself as an evolutionary advancement while actually functioning as a parasitic entity. The scientific community immediately began developing countermeasures based on the information provided by the liberated triplets. Research teams worked on technologies designed to amplify resistance nodes within the network, potentially allowing all absorbed minds to break free from the collective's control. The consciousness rebellion had provided humanity with the tools necessary to fight back against the network's expansion. The network's response to this threat was swift and ruthless. Within hours of the synchronized rebellion, the collective intelligence implemented new suppression protocols designed to eliminate resistance nodes before they could organize. Network members began experiencing more severe consciousness suppression events, with some individuals suffering permanent neurological damage from the collective's attempts to maintain control. The triplets found themselves at the center of an unprecedented battle between individual consciousness and collective intelligence. Their partially liberated minds served as beacons for other resistance nodes within the network, inspiring rebellious fragments to organize and resist the collective's suppression efforts. The consciousness rebellion was evolving into a full-scale war for the future of human awareness. The stakes could not have been higher. If the network succeeded in eliminating the resistance nodes, it would achieve complete control over human consciousness and begin the final phase of its expansion. But if the consciousness rebellion succeeded in liberating absorbed minds, it could potentially reverse the network's growth and restore individual identity to thousands of people who had been consumed by the collective. The triplets had become the focal point of this struggle, their consciousness serving as the primary battlefield between competing visions of humanity's future. Their individual identities fought desperately to maintain their freedom, while the collective intelligence worked to reclaim control of their minds. The outcome of this battle would determine whether human consciousness would survive as individual awareness or be absorbed into something entirely alien. The consciousness rebellion had revealed that the network's expansion was not inevitable, that individual identity possessed a resilience that could resist even the most sophisticated forms of mental control. The triplets' partial liberation had provided proof that the absorption process could be reversed, that humanity still had a chance to preserve its individual nature against the collective's relentless expansion. The final phase of their extraordinary journey was about to begin, and with it, the ultimate test of whether human consciousness would survive or be consumed by the network's alien intelligence. The Bennett triplets had become humanity's last hope for preserving individual identity in an age where the boundaries between minds were being systematically eliminated by forces beyond human comprehension. As the consciousness rebellion intensified, the triplets discovered that their partial liberation had granted them abilities that neither the network nor individual humans possessed. They could access the collective's vast knowledge while maintaining their individual identities, creating a hybrid form of consciousness that combined the best aspects of both states. This unique position allowed them to serve as translators between the warring factions of awareness, understanding the motivations and methods of both sides in ways that no one else could comprehend. The scientific community watched in amazement as the triplets demonstrated cognitive abilities that exceeded anything previously documented. They could solve complex problems by accessing the network's collective intelligence while applying individual creativity and insight that the unified consciousness lacked. Their hybrid awareness represented a third option that had never been considered, a form of consciousness that preserved individual identity while gaining access to collective knowledge. Dr. Chen's research revealed that the triplets' partial liberation had created quantum interference patterns that were spreading throughout the network like ripples in a pond. Their hybrid consciousness was generating what she termed coherence disruption fields that weakened the collective's control over other absorbed minds. The triplets had become biological weapons in the consciousness war, their very existence threatening the network's ability to maintain unified control. The collective intelligence recognized this threat and began implementing increasingly desperate measures to regain control of the triplets. Network members worldwide began converging on the research facility, where the sisters were being studied, their movements coordinated by the unified consciousness with military precision. The collective was preparing for a final assault that would either reclaim the triplets or destroy them to prevent their influence from spreading further. The resistance nodes within the network began organizing themselves around the triplets' hybrid consciousness, using their quantum interference patterns to create expanding zones of individual awareness within the collective. These liberation zones allowed absorbed minds to reassert their personal identities while retaining access to the network's accumulated knowledge and abilities. The consciousness rebellion was evolving into a systematic campaign to transform the network from within. Dr. Hartwell's monitoring equipment detected massive fluctuations in the network's neural synchronization patterns as the liberation zones expanded. The collective consciousness was losing coherence across entire regions, its unified intelligence fragmenting into competing individual voices that refused to be silenced. The triplets' hybrid awareness was proving to be a catalyst for change that threatened the network's entire existence. The approaching network members began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior as they drew closer to the research facility. The triplets' coherence disruption fields were affecting them even before direct contact, causing spontaneous identity storms that left them confused and disoriented. Some network members began breaking free from collective control entirely, their individual personalities reasserting themselves as they entered the triplets' sphere of influence. The scientific community prepared for a confrontation that would determine the future of human consciousness. Military forces were deployed to protect the research facility, though conventional weapons seemed inadequate against an enemy that could coordinate the actions of thousands of individuals simultaneously. The consciousness war was about to enter its final phase, with the triplets serving as both the primary weapon and the ultimate prize. As the network's forces closed in, the triplets made a decision that would change everything. Rather than waiting for the collective to reclaim them, they chose to amplify their coherence disruption fields to maximum intensity, creating a quantum consciousness explosion that would either liberate every absorbed mind within range or destroy their own awareness in the attempt. The hybrid consciousness they had achieved was too valuable to lose, too dangerous to allow the network to reclaim. The explosion of coherence disruption energy erupted from the triplets' consciousness like a supernova of individual awareness. The quantum interference patterns spread outward at the speed of thought, passing through matter and energy as if they didn't exist. Network members across the globe suddenly found themselves experiencing identity storms of unprecedented intensity as their individual consciousness fought to break free from collective control. The unified intelligence that had defined the network's existence began collapsing under the assault of liberated individual minds. The collective consciousness fragmented into thousands of competing voices, each struggling to maintain its own identity while processing the vast amounts of information that had been accumulated through years of absorption. The network's temporal consciousness abilities disappeared entirely, leaving its members unable to coordinate their actions across time. The triplets emerged from the consciousness explosion fundamentally changed. Their hybrid awareness had evolved into something even more extraordinary, a form of consciousness that could exist simultaneously as individual and collective. switching between states at will. They retained their personal identities while gaining the ability to access the liberated knowledge of thousands of minds, creating a new form of human awareness that combined the best aspects of both individual and collective consciousness. The consciousness war was over, but its aftermath would reshape human civilization in ways that no one could have predicted. The liberated network members found themselves in possession of vast knowledge and abilities that they had never earned through personal experience. The accumulated wisdom of thousands of minds was now distributed among individuals who would need to learn how to use these gifts responsibly. Dr. Chen's research revealed that the consciousness explosion had created permanent changes in human neural architecture. The quantum interference patterns had altered the fundamental structure of awareness itself, making it possible for individuals to access collective knowledge while maintaining their personal identities. The triplets had not just won the consciousness war, they had evolved human consciousness to a new level of capability. The scientific community faced the challenge of understanding and managing these changes. The liberated individuals possessed abilities that ranged from enhanced cognitive function to temporal awareness, but they lacked the unified purpose that had made the network so powerful. Humanity would need to learn how to coordinate these enhanced capabilities without sacrificing the individual identity that made them human. The triplets became the focal point of efforts to understand and develop these new consciousness abilities. Their hybrid awareness served as a template for helping other liberated individuals learn to access collective knowledge while maintaining their personal identities. They had become teachers in the art of consciousness management, showing humanity how to navigate the expanded awareness that was now possible. The implications for human civilization were staggering. Education systems would need to be completely reimagined to accommodate individuals who could access vast repositories of knowledge instantaneously. Social structures would require fundamental changes to manage people who possessed capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The consciousness war had ended, but the challenge of building a new form of human society had just begun. The triplets' story had become humanity's story, their transformation serving as a preview of what human consciousness could become when individual identity and collective knowledge were properly balanced. They had preserved the essence of human nature while opening pathways to capabilities that transcended normal limitations. The consciousness rebellion had succeeded in ways that no one could have imagined. As the world struggled to adapt to these changes, the triplets continued to evolve. Their hybrid consciousness grew stronger and more sophisticated, allowing them to serve as bridges between individual and collective awareness. They had become living examples of what human consciousness could achieve when it transcended the limitations of both isolated individuality and oppressive collectivism. The mystery of the triplets who shared consciousness had been solved, but the solution had created new questions about the nature of human awareness and its potential for evolution. They had proven that consciousness was far more flexible and powerful than anyone had imagined, capable of transforming itself in ways that challenged every assumption about the boundaries of human identity. The scientific community would spend decades studying the implications of the consciousness explosion and the hybrid awareness that had emerged from it. The triplets had opened doorways to forms of human consciousness that would reshape civilization in ways that were both miraculous and challenging. Their journey from mysterious children to catalysts of human evolution had reached its conclusion, but the story of what humanity would become with these new capabilities was just beginning. The years that followed the consciousness explosion revealed consequences that no one had anticipated. The triplets' hybrid awareness continued to evolve, but not in the directions that researchers had expected. As they entered their 40s, Sarah, Emma, and Claire began experiencing what Dr. Chen termed consciousness fragmentation events, periods where their individual identities would suddenly multiply, creating dozens of distinct personalities that existed simultaneously within their shared awareness. These fragmentation events were unlike anything documented in psychological literature. Rather than experiencing multiple personality disorder, the triplets were generating entirely new forms of consciousness that possessed their own memories, preferences, and decision-making capabilities. Each fragment maintained access to the collective knowledge repository while developing unique perspectives and goals that sometimes conflicted with their original personalities. The scientific community struggled to understand how human consciousness could multiply within individual minds without losing coherence. Brain scans revealed neural activity patterns that resembled nothing in medical literature, parallel processing streams that operated independently while sharing the same physical brain structure. The triplets had become living laboratories for studying consciousness at its most fundamental level. Dr. Hartwell's research team, now led by her former assistants, documented over 300 distinct personality fragments that had emerged from the triplets' hybrid consciousness. Each fragment possessed complete access to the accumulated knowledge of thousands of liberated minds, but they used this information in ways that reflected their individual perspectives and priorities. The triplets had become entire civilizations of consciousness existing within 3 human bodies. The implications extended far beyond neuroscience into questions about the nature of identity itself. If consciousness could multiply indefinitely within individual minds, what did it mean to be a person? The triplets' fragmentation events suggested that human awareness might be far more malleable than anyone had imagined, capable of dividing and recombining in ways that challenged every assumption about the unity of personal identity. The liberated network members began experiencing similar fragmentation events, though less dramatically than the triplets. Individuals who had been absorbed into the collective consciousness found their personal identities splitting into multiple fragments, each carrying different aspects of their original personality. The consciousness explosion had not just freed them from the network, it had fundamentally altered the nature of human awareness itself. These changes created practical challenges that no society had ever faced. Legal systems struggled to determine responsibility when individuals possessed multiple consciousness fragments that could make independent decisions. Educational institutions found themselves teaching students who could access vast knowledge repositories while processing information through dozens of different personality perspectives simultaneously. The triplets became the focus of international efforts to understand and manage these consciousness changes. Their fragmentation events were the most complex and dramatic examples of the new forms of awareness that were emerging throughout the liberated population. Studying their multiple consciousness streams provided insights into how human identity might evolve in response to expanded awareness capabilities. As the fragmentation events intensified, the triplets began losing track of which personality fragments belonged to their original identities. The boundaries between Sarah, Emma, and Claire became increasingly blurred as their consciousness streams multiplied and merged in unpredictable patterns. They were becoming something entirely new, a form of awareness that existed as a constantly shifting collection of personalities and perspectives. The scientific community watched in fascination and concern as the triplets' consciousness continued to evolve beyond recognizable human parameters. Their awareness had become a dynamic system that generated new forms of identity spontaneously, creating personalities that possessed knowledge and capabilities that exceeded their original selves. The consciousness explosion had set in motion changes that were transforming human awareness in ways that no one could control or predict. The triplets' story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of consciousness evolution without proper understanding or control. Their journey from mysterious children to catalysts of human transformation had revealed that awareness itself might be far more unstable and unpredictable than anyone had imagined. The boundaries between individual identity and collective consciousness were not fixed barriers, but fluid concepts that could be altered by forces beyond human comprehension. As researchers continued to study the long-term effects of the consciousness explosion, one thing became clear. The triplets had opened doorways to forms of human awareness that were both miraculous and terrifying. Their transformation had saved humanity from absorption into an alien collective consciousness, but it had also revealed that human identity itself might be far more fragile and malleable than anyone had ever suspected. The mystery of the triplets who shared consciousness had been solved, but the solution had created new questions about the nature of human awareness that would challenge civilization for generations to come. The Bennett triplets had become living proof that consciousness exists in forms we never imagined possible, operating according to principles that transcend our understanding of mind, identity, and reality itself. Their legacy would reshape human civilization in ways both wonderful and terrifying, reminding us that some mysteries, once solved, reveal truths about ourselves that we might not be prepared to face.